The silence is deafening. Across America, Europe, and even parts of Japan, motorcycle dealership floors stand empty while rows of unsold machines gather dust under fluorescent lights that illuminate nobody's dreams anymore. September 2025 will be remembered as the month when the global motorcycle industry didn't just stumble, it collapsed entirely. From coast to coast, dealerships display handwritten signs. Everything must go, liquidation sale, store closing. Brand new motorcycles that once carried $15,000 price tags now sit with desperate yellow stickers reading $8,999, then $6,499, then simply make offer. The wind moves through parking lots, where gleaming inventory once promised adventure and freedom, now offering only the hollow echo of an industry that built too much, sold too little, and waited too long to acknowledge reality. This isn't another cyclical downturn or temporary market adjustment. This is the final chapter of a story that began with optimism in 2023, turned to concern in 2024, and exploded into crisis in September 2025. The numbers tell a story of systemic failure. New motorcycle registrations, down 67% year-over-year, dealer inventory levels at 340% of normal capacity, and major manufacturers quietly halting production lines that had run continuously for decades. The crash happened so suddenly that industry insiders are still processing the magnitude. Trade publications that spent months publishing optimistic forecasts and rosy dealer interviews are now scrambling to explain how they missed the warning signs that, in retrospect, were everywhere. The motorcycle boom of 2020 to 2022, driven by pandemic-era demand for outdoor recreation and personal transportation, created an illusion of permanent growth that blinded manufacturers to changing consumer behavior. But the numbers were always fragile, built on stimulus money, historically low interest rates, and a temporary cultural moment when motorcycles represented escape from lockdowns and urban restrictions. When those conditions changed, the foundation cracked. When financing became expensive, inventory became overwhelming, and consumer priorities shifted back to practical concerns, the entire structure collapsed. Behind every statistic lies a human story. Mike Rodriguez closed his family's motorcycle dealership in Phoenix after 37 years, unable to service the debt on inventory that wouldn't sell. Sarah Chen, who had saved for 2 years to buy her first touring bike, watched prices drop so rapidly that she decided to wait indefinitely, certain that next month would bring even better deals. Tom Bradley, a factory worker in Milwaukee, received his layoff notice as production slowed to levels not seen since the 1970s recession. The crash exposed fundamental disconnects between what manufacturers thought consumers wanted and what they actually needed. While companies invested billions in developing ever more sophisticated motorcycles with electronic rider aids, smartphone connectivity, and premium materials, buyers increasingly chose used machines that offered similar performance at fraction of the cost. The gap between manufacturer ambition and consumer reality became unbridgeable. The oversupply storm. The collapse didn't begin in September 2025. It began in corporate boardrooms in late 2022, when manufacturers made production decisions based on pandemic-era sales data that would prove catastrophically wrong. Convinced that the motorcycle boom represented permanent market expansion rather than temporary surge, companies ramped up production to levels designed to satisfy demand that was already beginning to evaporate. Internal documents later revealed that several major manufacturers recognized the danger as early as mid-2023, when dealer inventory levels began climbing beyond sustainable ratios. But contractual obligations, production commitments, and corporate optimism prevented the dramatic production cuts that might have prevented catastrophe. Instead of acknowledging the problem, manufacturers doubled down, offering dealer incentives, extended payment terms, and marketing support designed to move inventory that was becoming increasingly difficult to sell. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Motorcycles that cost $12,000 to manufacture carried suggested retail prices of $18,000, creating artificial value that could only be maintained through careful inventory management and strong consumer demand. When demand softened and inventory accumulated, the entire pricing structure became unsustainable. dealers found themselves carrying motorcycles worth less than their wholesale cost, creating negative equity that made new orders impossible. Warehouses across the Midwest filled with unsold 2023, 2024, and early 2025 models, as manufacturers continued shipping motorcycles that dealers had no realistic hope of selling. Some facilities housed over 10,000 unsold units, representing hundreds of millions in inventory that would never generate retail revenue. The carrying costs alone, insurance, storage, maintenance, and financing created financial burdens that grew larger every month. Manufacturers tried desperately to maintain the fiction that the inventory represented temporary market adjustments rather than fundamental oversupply. Press releases celebrated production milestones and new model introductions while avoiding any mention of accumulating unsold inventory. Annual reports discussed market challenges in general terms without providing specific data about the true scale of unsold motorcycle stockpiles. The denial extended to dealer relations, where manufacturer representatives continued pushing new inventory, even as showroom floors overflowed with unsold machines from previous model years. Dealers who protested were reminded of contractual obligations and threatened with franchise termination. The pressure to accept additional inventory created resentment and mistrust that further damaged manufacturer-dealer relationships. By early 2025, some dealers were storing unsold motorcycles in off-site locations, empty strip mall stores, and even outdoor lots protected by nothing more than tarps and chain-link fencing. The visual impact of these motorcycle graveyards created negative publicity that further damaged consumer confidence in the industry's stability and future viability. The oversupply crisis was compounded by manufacturer reluctance to reduce production, which would have required acknowledging the scope of the problem to shareholders and creditors. Instead, companies continued building motorcycles for markets that no longer existed, creating inventory levels that eventually became mathematically impossible to clear through normal retail channels. The financing collapse. While manufacturers struggled with inventory management, a parallel crisis was developing in motorcycle financing that would prove equally devastating to industry stability. The Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate increases throughout 2024 and early 2025 transformed motorcycle purchasing from affordable monthly payments into financial burdens that pushed bikes beyond the reach of middle-class buyers who represented the industry's core market. Motorcycle loans that carried 3.9% annual percentage rates in 2022 jumped to 8.7%, then 11.3%, then over 14% for buyers with less than perfect credit scores. The monthly payment on a $15,000 motorcycle increased from manageable $280 to crushing $460, effectively eliminating entire demographic segments from the potential buyer pool. Young professionals, working families, and first-time buyers found themselves priced out of markets they had recently dominated. Credit approval rates plummeted as lending institutions tightened standards in response to economic uncertainty and rising default rates across consumer credit categories. Banks that had readily financed motorcycle purchases during the pandemic boom began treating motorcycle loans as luxury discretionary spending rather than legitimate transportation needs. Approval rates dropped from over 80% in 2022 to under 40% by mid-2025. The psychological impact on potential buyers was immediate and devastating. Customers who had planned motorcycle purchases for months or years found themselves facing financing costs that made their dream machines unaffordable. Dealership showrooms that had bustled with qualified buyers became gathering places for browsers who could admire but not purchase the motorcycles they desired. Manufacturers' captive financing arms, which had become crucial profit centers during the boom years, found themselves squeezed between rising borrowing costs and declining credit quality among applicants. Honda Financial Services, Yamaha Motor Finance, and similar subsidiaries reported dramatic increases in loan losses as economic pressure forced borrowers to default on motorcycle payments before defaulting on mortgages or car loans. The financing crisis created vicious cycles that accelerated industry decline. As new bike sales plummeted due to financing difficulties, used motorcycle values dropped correspondingly, reducing trade-in values that many buyers depended on to make new purchases affordable. Customers who might have traded up to newer models found their existing motorcycles worth thousands less than expected, eliminating their purchasing power for replacement machines. Leasing programs, which had helped make premium motorcycles accessible to cost-conscious buyers, became unsustainable as residual values collapsed. Motorcycles leased for 3 years returned to dealers worth far less than their projected values, creating losses that forced manufacturers to abandon or dramatically restructure leasing programs that had driven significant sales volume. The financing collapse disproportionately affected younger buyers, who represented the industry's future growth potential. First-time motorcycle buyers, typically in their 20s and 30s, found themselves completely priced out of new motorcycle ownership. This demographic shift threatened not just current sales, but the pipeline of enthusiasts who would drive future demand. The used bike flood. As new motorcycle sales stumbled, the used bike market became flooded with nearly new machines that offered compelling alternatives to dealer showroom inventory. Pandemic-era buyers who had purchased motorcycles with stimulus money or emergency low interest rates found themselves financially pressured to sell, creating a secondary market glut that made new motorcycle purchases economically irrational for value-conscious consumers. Online marketplaces became filled with 2022 and 2023 motorcycles, showing fewer than 5,000 miles, offered by sellers who needed cash more than recreational vehicles. These nearly new machines, many still under factory warranty, sold for 40 to 50% less than comparable new motorcycles, while offering essentially identical performance and reliability. The value proposition was so compelling that even affluent buyers began questioning the wisdom of purchasing new when used alternatives were available at dramatic discounts. The psychological impact on new motorcycle sales was immediate and devastating. Potential buyers who visited dealerships to examine new inventory would leave to research used alternatives, discovering that patients could save thousands of dollars with minimal sacrifice in quality or features. Dealer salespeople found themselves competing not just with other dealerships, but with private sellers offering better motorcycles at lower prices. Motorcycle auction websites reported unprecedented inventory levels as desperate sellers attempted to liquidate machines they could no longer afford or justify owning. Barrett-Jackson, Meckham, and regional auction houses added motorcycle-only events to handle the volume of consigned machines. But even auction prices reflected the market's oversupply problem. Motorcycles that had sold for premium prices just months earlier struggled to find buyers at any price. The flood of used inventory created downward price pressure that spread throughout the entire motorcycle ecosystem. Dealers found their used bike lots competing with cheaper private party sales, while new motorcycle pricing became increasingly divorced from market reality. The traditional depreciation curve that had made new motorcycle ownership economically predictable collapsed as used values plummeted unpredictably. Insurance companies began adjusting coverage values downward as claim settlements reflected rapidly declining market values. Riders who had purchased comprehensive coverage based on original purchase prices found themselves underinsured as their motorcycles' actual cash values dropped below loan balances, creating negative equity situations that trapped owners in underwater financing arrangements. The used bike flood particularly devastated premium and luxury motorcycle segments, where manufacturers had invested heavily in developing high-margin models with sophisticated electronics and premium materials. These expensive machines depreciated so rapidly in the used market that their new pricing became completely untenable, forcing manufacturers to abandon entire product categories that had previously generated substantial profits. Motorcycle rental companies, which had expanded significantly during the pandemic boom, began liquidating their fleets as rental demand decreased and fleet values collapsed. These late-model, well-maintained machines entered the used market in large numbers, further increasing supply and reducing prices for both dealers and private sellers attempting to move their own inventory. The global chain reaction. The American motorcycle market collapse sent shockwaves through the global industry, exposing the interconnected nature of modern motorcycle manufacturing and distribution. Japanese manufacturers, who had dominated global markets through their reputation for reliability and innovation, found themselves facing their most serious crisis since the 1970s recession that had originally motivated their international expansion. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki had built their business models around high-volume production that achieved economies of scale through global distribution. When the American market, their largest and most profitable export destination, suddenly contracted by over 60%, the entire production equation became unsustainable. Factory utilization rates dropped below break-even points, forcing difficult decisions about plant closures and workforce reductions. European manufacturers faced similar pressures as economic uncertainty and rising energy costs reduced demand in their home markets, while American export opportunities disappeared. BMW Motorrad, Ducati, and KTM had invested heavily in American market expansion, building dealer networks and marketing programs designed to capture growth that no longer existed. These investments became stranded assets that generated costs without corresponding revenues. The crisis exposed the motorcycle industry's dependence on American consumer spending power, which had supported global production levels for decades. When American buyers disappeared from the market, manufacturers found themselves unable to replace that demand through expansion in other regions, where economic conditions were equally challenging and consumer preferences differed significantly from American requirements. Indian and Chinese manufacturers, who had been preparing aggressive expansion into Western markets, found their timing catastrophically wrong. Companies like TVS, Bajaj, and various Chinese brands had invested billions in developing motorcycles designed to compete with Japanese manufacturers in American and European markets, only to discover that those markets were contracting rapidly rather than expanding as projected. The global supply chain disruptions that had plagued the motorcycle industry since 2020 became even more severe as reduced demand made component sourcing uneconomical. Suppliers who had expanded capacity to meet projected growth requirements found themselves with excess capacity and reduced order volumes, forcing consolidation and closures that further disrupted remaining production. Shipping companies reported dramatic reductions in motorcycle container volumes as export-oriented manufacturers cut production and cancelled overseas shipments. Port facilities that had specialized in motorcycle handling saw traffic decrease by over 70%, forcing layoffs and facility closures that reduced the infrastructure available for any future recovery. Currency fluctuations added another layer of complexity, as economic uncertainty affected exchange rates between major manufacturing and consuming countries. Japanese manufacturers found their cost structures distorted by yen strength that made their products more expensive in dollar-denominated markets, while European manufacturers faced similar pressures from euro volatility. The global nature of the collapse meant that manufacturers couldn't simply redirect inventory from weak markets to strong ones, because no strong markets existed. The synchronized decline across all major motorcycle markets created unprecedented challenges that individual companies couldn't solve through traditional strategies like regional reallocation or product mix adjustments. The dealer's desperation. Behind every industry statistic lies a human story, and nowhere is the motorcycle market collapse more visible than in the dealerships where family businesses built over decades are facing extinction. These retailers, who had invested their lives and savings in the belief that Americans would always want motorcycles, found themselves trapped between manufacturer contracts that required inventory purchases and customer bases that had simply vanished. Frank Martinez, who operated 3 motorcycle dealerships across Arizona for over 20 years, describes the financial pressure as unbearable. His showrooms, which had generated steady profits throughout the 2010s and boomed during the pandemic, now hemorrhage money daily. The motorcycles that fill his floor plan cost him interest charges that exceed his monthly sales revenue, creating negative cash flow that forces him to choose between paying employees and meeting loan obligations. The mathematics of motorcycle retail become impossible when inventory doesn't move. Dealers typically finance their inventory through floor plan loans that carry monthly interest charges, averaging 8 to 12% annually. When motorcycles sell quickly, these financing costs are manageable and predictable. When inventory stagnates, the carrying costs can exceed the gross profit margins on successful sales, making it impossible to operate profitably, even with dramatically reduced overhead. Manufacturer pressure compounds the financial stress as companies attempt to maintain production levels by forcing dealers to accept additional inventory regardless of local market conditions. Franchise agreements that once provided mutual benefit became one-sided contracts that required dealers to stock motorcycles they couldn't sell, while providing minimal manufacturer support for moving aged inventory. Employee relationships suffer as dealerships reduce staff to cut costs, forcing remaining workers to handle multiple responsibilities while facing uncertain employment futures. Salespeople who had earned good livings during the boom years find themselves competing desperately for the few remaining customers, often selling motorcycles at prices that generate minimal commission income. The emotional toll on dealer families extends beyond financial concerns. Many dealerships represent multi-generational family businesses where children grew up expecting to inherit enterprises that provided comfortable middle-class lifestyles. The prospect of losing businesses that took decades to build creates family stress that extends far beyond immediate financial concerns. Customer relationships become strained as dealers implement increasingly desperate sales tactics designed to move inventory at any cost. Buyers who had previously trusted their local dealers find themselves pressured with high-pressure sales techniques and pricing that changes daily as desperation drives decision-making. The community trust that had sustained many dealerships through previous difficulties erodes as customer service suffers under financial pressure. Service departments, which had traditionally provided steady profit margins to offset new bike sales volatility, find themselves competing with independent shops and online parts suppliers as motorcycle owners defer maintenance and repairs due to economic uncertainty. The reduced service revenue removes another pillar of dealership financial stability. Real estate becomes another pressure point, as dealers who own their facilities face property tax obligations and mortgage payments, while those who lease struggle with rental costs that reflect pre-crash market assumptions. The illusion of real estate wealth evaporates as commercial properties designed for motorcycle retail lose value due to industry decline. The rider's perspective. For motorcycle enthusiasts watching the industry collapse, the emotional response combines excitement about unprecedented bargain opportunities with deep anxiety about the future of motorcycling culture. Riders find themselves in the strange position of benefiting from industry distress while mourning the loss of the vibrant dealer networks and manufacturer support that had sustained their passion for decades. Sarah Thompson, who had dreamed of owning a premium touring motorcycle for over 5 years, suddenly finds herself able to afford machines that were previously beyond her budget. The BMW R1250 GS Adventure, that carried a $19,000 price tag 18 months ago, is now available for $12,500 at desperate dealerships willing to sell below cost to generate cash flow. Yet, instead of celebrating, she feels uncertain about making major purchases during industry upheaval. The psychology of buying during market collapse creates paradoxical consumer behavior. Rational analysis suggests that current conditions offer the best motorcycle values in decades, with new machines available at used bike prices and dealer service included. However, the same economic uncertainty that created these bargains makes consumers reluctant to commit to large discretionary purchases, particularly when prices continue dropping monthly. Younger riders, who represent the industry's future, face particularly complex decisions. The collapse has made motorcycle ownership more affordable than ever, but also raised questions about long-term parts availability, service support, and resale values. First-time buyers wonder whether purchasing motorcycles from struggling manufacturers represents smart opportunism or dangerous timing. Experienced riders watch dealer closures with genuine sadness, recognizing that they're losing not just retail outlets, but community gathering places, where knowledge was shared and relationships were built. The local motorcycle dealer had served functions beyond simple sales, providing mechanical expertise, organizing group rides, and maintaining the social fabric that connected riders across geographic and demographic boundaries. The uncertainty extends to motorcycle culture itself. Riding groups that had organized around specific brands or dealer relationships find themselves questioning whether their preferred manufacturers will survive the crisis. Long-term touring plans become complicated by concerns about finding authorized service centers or obtaining warranty coverage during extended trips. Used motorcycle values create both opportunities and anxiety for current owners. Riders who had built equity in their machines find their assets worth significantly less than expected, while those seeking to upgrade discover that their trade-ins won't cover as much of new bike purchases as previously assumed. The traditional cycle of trading up to newer or more sophisticated machines breaks down when financial calculations no longer support periodic upgrading. Insurance and financing considerations add another layer of complexity. Motorcycle insurance rates have increased as insurers adjust to higher claim frequencies and reduced vehicle values, while financing remains expensive and difficult to obtain. These practical concerns force riders to approach motorcycle ownership more conservatively than during previous market cycles. Despite the challenges, many riders express cautious optimism that the industry shakeout might ultimately benefit motorcycle culture by eliminating marginal players and forcing manufacturers to focus on building better products for committed enthusiasts, rather than chasing mass market growth that proved unsustainable. The manufacturer's silence. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the motorcycle market collapse is the studied silence maintained by major manufacturers who continue issuing optimistic press releases and forward-looking statements while quietly implementing dramatic production cuts and workforce reductions. This disconnect between public communications and private actions has created credibility gaps that may prove more damaging than the immediate financial crisis. Honda's corporate communications continue emphasizing long-term growth opportunities and technological innovation, while the company has halted production at 2 American assembly facilities and delayed introduction of 6 planned new models. Press releases celebrate sustainability initiatives and electric motorcycle development, while avoiding any mention of the 3,000 layoffs implemented across North American operations. The silence extends to dealer communications, where manufacturer representatives provide carefully scripted reassurances about market conditions while offering no concrete assistance for moving accumulated inventory. Dealers report feeling abandoned by manufacturers who created the oversupply crisis through unrealistic production forecasts and contractual requirements that forced acceptance of unsaleable inventory. Industry trade publications, which depend on manufacturer advertising revenue for survival, find themselves in difficult positions when attempting to report honestly about market conditions while maintaining relationships with corporate sponsors. The result is coverage that acknowledges challenges in general terms while avoiding specific analysis of manufacturer responsibility for current conditions. Securities and Exchange Commission filings provide glimpses behind corporate communication strategies, revealing inventory write-downs, production adjustments, and financial provisions that contradict optimistic public statements. These regulatory disclosures, written in technical language that obscures their implications, tell the real story of an industry in crisis, while public relations departments maintain facades of business-as-usual optimism. Manufacturer silence becomes particularly problematic when dealers and consumers seek guidance about future product plans, parts availability, and warranty coverage. The lack of transparent communication creates uncertainty that further damages confidence in industry stability and recovery prospects. Customers hesitate to make purchases when manufacturers won't commit to long-term support for their products. The strategic silence also prevents honest assessment of what went wrong and how future mistakes might be avoided. Without acknowledgement of forecasting failures, inventory management problems, and market analysis errors, the industry cannot learn from its mistakes or implement changes needed to prevent similar crises in the future. International markets react negatively to perceived lack of transparency from American and Japanese manufacturers, creating additional challenges for companies attempting to maintain global sales volumes as domestic markets contract. European and emerging market buyers become skeptical of manufacturers who won't honestly discuss their financial stability and long-term viability. The silence becomes self-perpetuating, as manufacturers fear that honest acknowledgement of problems will create additional negative publicity and further damage sales. However, the credibility lost through perceived dishonesty may ultimately prove more harmful than temporary embarrassment from acknowledging mistakes and outlining recovery plans. The hidden winners. While major manufacturers and traditional dealerships struggle with industry collapse, several market segments are experiencing unexpected growth as the crisis creates opportunities for nimble operators who can adapt quickly to changing conditions. These hidden winners demonstrate that even severe market disruptions create value for those positioned to capitalize on chaos. Independent motorcycle service shops are experiencing unprecedented demand as riders defer new motorcycle purchases while investing more heavily in maintaining their existing machines. Small garages that had struggled to compete with dealer service departments suddenly find themselves booked weeks in advance as owners seek to extend the life of motorcycles they can't afford to replace. Used motorcycle parts dealers report dramatic increases in both supply and demand, as crashed motorcycles provide salvage inventory, while cost-conscious riders seek affordable alternatives to new replacement components. Online parts marketplaces show triple-digit growth, as the combination of abundant supply and price-sensitive demand creates ideal conditions for secondary market transactions. Custom motorcycle builders find themselves overwhelmed with requests from riders who want to personalize their existing machines rather than purchase new ones. The combination of affordable donor bikes and riders' desire to create unique expressions from mass-produced motorcycles has created a renaissance in custom building that spans from simple modifications to complete ground-up reconstructions. Motorcycle auction companies benefit from the flood of consigned inventory, as dealers and private owners seek alternative disposal methods for machines they cannot sell through traditional channels. Online auction platforms report record transaction volumes as geographic barriers disappear and buyers nationwide compete for bargain-priced inventory. Independent importers, specializing in gray market motorcycles, find opportunities to source interesting machines from overseas markets, where different economic conditions and consumer preferences create arbitrage opportunities. Models unavailable through traditional distribution channels attract enthusiasts willing to accept service challenges in exchange for unique ownership experiences. Training organizations and riding schools experience increased enrollment as new riders take advantage of affordable motorcycle prices while recognizing the need for proper instruction before attempting independent riding. The combination of accessible pricing and safety awareness creates ideal conditions for riding education businesses. Motorcycle storage and transportation services benefit as owners seek to preserve their investments during uncertain times. Climate-controlled storage facilities report increased demand from riders who want to maintain their motorcycle's condition while determining whether to sell during the market downturn or wait for potential recovery. Electric motorcycle manufacturers and conversion specialists find audiences among environmentally conscious riders who see traditional industry struggles as opportunities to embrace alternative technologies. The conventional motorcycle crisis creates space for innovative solutions that might have struggled to gain attention during normal market conditions. These success stories demonstrate that market disruptions, while painful for established players, create opportunities for innovative businesses that can serve changing customer needs. The motorcycle industry's transformation may ultimately produce a more diverse and resilient ecosystem that better serves riding communities across different economic conditions. The future. As the dust settles on the motorcycle industry's most dramatic collapse since the Great Depression, the outlines of a fundamentally different future begin to emerge. The next chapter of motorcycling won't be written by corporate boardrooms planning mass production strategies, but by smaller players who understand that sustainability matters more than growth, quality trumps quantity, and community connections provide more value than marketing campaigns. The manufacturers that survive will be those that learned the hardest lesson of the 2025 collapse. Building motorcycles that nobody wants is worse than building too few motorcycles that everybody desires. Future production planning will prioritize accuracy over optimism, with smaller production runs, longer model cycles, and manufacturing strategies designed to match supply precisely to verified demand rather than hoped-for expansion. Dealer networks will emerge leaner but stronger, with fewer locations serving larger geographic areas and providing deeper expertise in specific motorcycle categories. The survivors will be those who built genuine customer relationships rather than depending on manufacturer incentives and high-pressure sales tactics. Service excellence and community building will replace inventory turnover as primary success metrics. The motorcycle ownership model will shift toward longer-term relationships between riders and their machines, with greater emphasis on maintenance, customization, and personalization rather than frequent upgrading to newer models. This change will support thriving aftermarket industries and custom builders who can extend motorcycle life cycles while providing individual expression opportunities. Electric motorcycle adoption will accelerate as traditional manufacturers' production capabilities contract and innovative companies gain market share by default. The collapse of conventional motorcycle pricing will make electric alternatives more competitive, while environmental concerns drive some buyers towards sustainable transportation options. Regional motorcycle cultures will strengthen as global standardization pressures diminish with manufacturer consolidation. Local builders, parts suppliers, and service providers will gain importance as riders seek alternatives to corporate motorcycle ownership models that proved fragile during economic stress. The rider community itself will become more self-reliant and interconnected, with knowledge sharing, mutual support, and collective problem-solving replacing dependence on manufacturer support and dealer services. Online communities and local organizations will assume greater importance in maintaining motorcycle culture continuity. International trade patterns will shift as American market dominance declines, and manufacturers focus on serving multiple smaller markets rather than depending on single large export destinations. This diversification may create more stable global industry structures, less vulnerable to regional economic disruptions. Technology development will slow but become more focused on proven solutions, rather than cutting-edge features that add complexity without corresponding benefits. Simplicity, reliability, and serviceability will regain importance, as riders demand motorcycles that serve transportation needs, rather than showcasing technological sophistication. The collapse forced a reset that eliminates excess capacity, reduces dealer networks to sustainable levels, and refocuses manufacturer priorities on building motorcycles for people who actually want them. While painful for everyone involved, this correction may ultimately create a healthier industry, better aligned with realistic market demands and customer needs. Reflection and hope. The motorcycle market crash of September 2025 represents more than corporate miscalculation or economic cyclical adjustment. It reflects fundamental changes in how Americans relate to transportation, recreation, and discretionary spending that manufacturers failed to recognize until market forces imposed harsh corrections. For decades, the motorcycle industry operated on assumptions that growth was inevitable, that new models would always find buyers, and that marketing could create demand where none existed naturally. The pandemic boom reinforced these beliefs temporarily, creating false confidence that justified production decisions that proved catastrophically wrong when market conditions normalized. The human cost extends beyond corporate losses to include family businesses destroyed, careers interrupted, and dreams deferred by economic forces beyond individual control. Dealers who invested their lives in businesses they believed would provide lifetime security found themselves facing bankruptcy through no fault of their own, except trusting manufacturer projections that proved wildly optimistic. Yet within the destruction lie seeds of renewal. The collapse forces honest assessment of what went wrong and creates opportunities for building something better from the wreckage. The next generation of motorcycle companies will be founded on realistic market analysis, conservative growth projections, and deep understanding of customer needs, rather than wishful thinking about market expansion. The riders who remain committed to motorcycling through this crisis represent the core community that will sustain whatever industry emerges from the current chaos. Their loyalty to the fundamental experience of motorcycling, independent of brand marketing and corporate messaging, provides the foundation upon which recovery can be built. Small businesses that adapt quickly to serve changing customer needs will thrive in the transformed landscape, while creative individuals who see opportunities rather than obstacles will build the custom culture, service networks, and community connections that make motorcycling meaningful beyond mere transportation. The collapse reminds us that industries built on hype rather than substance eventually face reality, but it also demonstrates that genuine value survives market disruption. Great motorcycles from the boom years will continue providing transportation and recreation long after the companies that built them have been forgotten. The joy of riding transcends corporate success or failure. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis strips away the illusions and marketing noise that had obscured motorcycling's essential appeal, the simple human desire to move through the world with freedom, efficiency, and connection to the environment. This core experience remains unchanged by market conditions, and will eventually attract new generations of riders, regardless of industry structure. The next chapter of American motorcycling will be written not in corporate boardrooms, but in garage workshops, local riding groups, and the imaginations of people who understand that the best transportation solutions often come from individual creativity rather than mass production. The future belongs to those who never stopped believing in the motorcycle's fundamental promise, even when the market temporarily did.